Hello, my name's Anthony on the Bicep engineering team, and today I wanted to give people a quick overview of local deploy, along with some interesting scenarios that you can accomplish with local deploy. So what is Bicep local deploy? This is a new experimental feature we've created for Bicep. As many of you know already, you can use Bicep to deploy ARM resources. You can deploy MS Graph resources with the MS Graph extension, and you can also deploy Kubernetes resources with the Kubernetes extension. So all of those capabilities, those require you to have an Azure account, and those require you to create an Azure deployment to accomplish, even the MS Graph and the Kubernetes examples. Local deploy actually basically runs the entire deployment client side. So inside the Bicep CLI itself. So that you can run entirely without an Azure account. You can run entirely like on a client machine without an internet connection. You can run it in a CI pipeline or a CD pipeline. So I'm going to walk you through one of these samples. The first one to show you is this GitHub OIDC sample. This repo I will share with everyone. It's all on my GitHub account. So let's start by taking a look at the main Bicep file. So what is new here? We have target scope equals local. This is basically telling Bicep that the file I'm trying to deploy here is not going to execute on Azure, it's just going to execute locally. I've got extension AZ, which is me importing the Azure namespace, which is available by default in non-local Bicep. And I've got this local extension, which is a proof of concept extension I created that allows you to do scripting like bash scripting and PowerShell scripting in Bicep. So first of all, we've got our script resource here. This is a bash script, and I'm using it to obtain an auth token, which then I'm then going to use to perform my GitHub operations. Next, I've got my Azure module. This one is interesting because it is actually, if we look inside this module, it's actually a standard ARM deployment. So when I actually go and deploy this module, it's actually going to go and use my Azure account, and it's going to run just a regular deployment on Azure. So that's why I'm passing in a subscription ID for the scope here. Finally, I've got my Azure module, and then I'm then going to interact with the GitHub API using this GitHub module. So let's quickly take a look at the Azure module. In here, this is a standard ARM scope. So we've got a subscription scope deployment. I'm importing the MS Graph extension. I'm explicitly importing the AZ extension, but this is the same as the standard AZ namespace, which is available by default in Bicep today. So inside this file, I'm using the MS Graph extension to deploy a MS Graph application. I'm setting up federated identity credentials. I'm creating a GitHub service principal, a MS Graph service principal. I'm then creating a resource group, and I'm giving my newly created application owner access on that resource group. So all in all, this is going to allow me to configure my GitHub actions, the ability to connect to my Azure account and perform Azure operations in that resource group using OIDC. So finally, I'm outputting the config that I need for that OIDC connection. We've got tenant ID, subscription ID, and client ID, which are the requirements if you've set up OIDC before. So going back to my main Bicep file, I've output those values, and the next thing I need to do is access them in my GitHub module and create the repository. So I'm using my GitHub token. This is my configuration for the GitHub repo, and this is the OIDC config. So if we take a look here, so again, we're running this one locally, target scope equals local. I'm configuring my GitHub extension with the token I created. I'm creating a GitHub repository here. I'm then taking those different OIDC configurations and setting them up as GitHub action secrets here. And then finally, just to demonstrate it, I'm also adding some collaborators, giving people write permission to my repository that I'm creating. So while I talk through the rest, I'm just going to quickly run this deployment so you can see it running. So while that's running, let's talk over the Bicep param file. I've got my configuration for my resource group, my subscription ID for my Azure subscription, the name of the resource group, and the location for the resource group. I've also got my configuration for the GitHub repo I want to create. This is my GitHub username, and this is the name of the repo I want to create. And these are the two collaborators I want to give right access to that repo. Finally, there's the Bicep config. So obviously, I've got my experimental feature enabled local deploy. And then I've got, if you're used to working with the msgraph extension, I've got the standard msgraph extension enabled here. What is new is I've got my local extension I created and my GitHub extension. These are fully open source, so if you want to look at how an extension is created, you can look at these repos yourself, and that includes everything from the actual extension code to the automation you need to publish it and make it available through an ACR instance. So this is aliasing my two custom extensions I've created to local and GitHub, which is what allows me to access them with the extension keyword here. Finally, implicit extensions. This is the other thing you probably haven't seen before. That is, with Bicep being Azure focused, the Azure extension or the Azure namespace is imported by default. When I'm running locally, I don't want the Azure namespace to be imported by default. So implicit extensions here is basically saying unimport the Azure namespace unless it's explicitly imported, which is why if we look at some of these files, we've got extension AZ is explicitly imported. Okay, so we can see our local deployment finished. I've just added these two outputs just so I can show you what things look like. Let's click through to the repo I've created. So this is not particularly interesting. It's a completely blank repo. But if we look at the settings here, we can see that the two collaborators I wanted to give access to, I've given access to. And then if we look at secrets and variables, we can see those three repository secrets that we need for the OIDC connection have been created. Secondly, let's take a look at the Azure portal. I will show you what the resource group looks like. So this is the resource group I've created. If we look at access control, we should be able to see the RBAC assignment that was created. So we've got our Bicep local deploy test service principles being created here, and it's been given owner access to the resource group as configured in the Bicep file. And if we click through, we should be able to see the msgraph application that was created as well. So that's a scenario which I personally use a lot, just for, it's fairly common to want to configure a GitHub repo to have the actions within that repo to have access to Azure to be able to, for example, deploy more resources. Second example I want to show, I'm just going to walk through pretty quickly, is local deploy Kubernetes. So this is something pretty different. It's deploying a set of Kubernetes resources locally. So again, pretty similar. We've got the local extension imported, and I'm using that script resource again to execute a bash script. This time I'm using the kubectl command to access the kube-config for a local Kubernetes cluster I have installed. And in my AKS store module, I'm deploying a pretty large AKS example or set of Kubernetes example resources. This one is just deploying I think it's a front-end application with some backing resources for a kind of like demo store. So again, let's run this one. And then while that's running in my Bicep param, nothing particularly interesting to see here because I haven't configured any parameters. But in my Bicep config, again, I'm using that same local extension for scripting, and I've got my Kubernetes extension for talking to Kubernetes resources. So we can see everything's deployed here. And if I click through to my front-end application, here is my Contoso pet store, which is the dummy application. Okay, that's all I had. So as I mentioned earlier, this is experimental functionality, but it is, I have the nightly version of Bicep installed right now, but this will all be available in the upcoming Bicep release. So as of the June release, you should be able to install the Bicep CLI and access this functionality yourself. And you'll be able to deploy any of these samples that I've created here, which I'll share with you soon. Thank you.